Magna Carta. What was it about? Why was it so important? And who gives a shit? Well, Magna Carta was basically a piece of paper. And on this piece of paper was written a list of rules that the king had to accept and follow. Otherwise, he was in the shit. How can it possibly happen that the king has to follow rules? Now, the king surely is the one to make the rules, not follow the rules. Um, but something happened that made it so that the king ends up sitting down on a chair and signing a piece of fucking paper, agreeing to do what some other cunts tell him to do. So how did that happen? Right. The king we're talking about is King John. Now, King John was the king during during the 13th century, and he was the brother of famous King Richard Lionheart, and also the son of the famous Henry II. Now, John was universally acknowledged as being a bit of a cunt, to say the least. He was the man who castrated and blinded his nephew and then had him thrown in the river, killed. He was the man who lost all of his father's territories in France by losing battles against the French. John was a man who is the villain in every Robin Hood film, and John was such a cunt that the British monarchy has never had a King John since. Even though John is the most common name in England, there has been no King John since him, because he was such a cunt that nobody else wants to have the same fucking name as him. What was he doing apart from losing wars and blinding people and cutting their cocks and balls off? Well, he used to go around telling people who they had to marry, and he was taking money off of people for himself, and he treated the kingdom and the crown as if it was his own personal thing. And he had absolutely no interest in anybody else, in anybody else's well-being, or anybody else's rights or anything like that. He used to shag other people's wives, and he used to steal other people's lands and castles and territories and titles and everything for himself or to give to his friends. He was an absolute fucking arsehole. His brother Richard had been a bit of a cunt, but everyone thought he was fucking brilliant, Richard, because Richard went on the Crusades and killed Muslims. And obviously, in those times, people were extremely religious, and anybody who fought in a crusade was seen as being fucking brilliant. And Richard was a man who didn't like England and spent most of his time in France and spoke French and didn't speak English and said London can go fuck itself. I'd fucking sell London if I could. And England's shit. But the English still think he's the best king ever, and there's a big statue of the cunt outside the Houses of Parliament. Even though he was a fucking mental murdering bastard. And Richard died from being shot by some cunt with a crossbow in France. So then after Richard died, then we get John. And John didn't have any lands because he was the youngest son and he wasn't given any lands by his father, so he was called John Lackland as a nickname, which pissed him off. He had a war against his nephew because his older brother, what was his fucking name? Geoffrey. Geoffrey had died and left a son, and really, by the rules of succession, Geoffrey's son should have been the fucking king and not John. But so John just took over the throne and then had his nephew castrated and blinded and then murdered instead. Anyway, we're talking about Magna Carta. So John made the mistake of pissing off the wrong people, and by that I mean all of the nobility, all of the aristocracy, and all of the church. You see, the system of government that existed in those times was called the feudal system. And the feudal system is a hierarchy, like a pyramid, and at the top is the king. And the king is just one man, so he can't do everything himself. So he has beneath him lords, dukes, earls, counts, barons, etc. And these people are the people who own and control large parts of the country and lots of castles. And these nobles have knights who work for them, and the knights are military men, and the knights have sort of lower peasants and people who work underneath them. The king, John, was pissing off the nobles, and the nobles control the knights, and the knights control the money and everything else, and fucking hell. And anyway, he was going around and saying, fucking hell, I can do whatever the fuck I want because I'm the king. So I'm going to take this, I'm going to do this to you, I'm going to fuck you over, I'm going to fuck this one over. And he just pissed everybody off really badly by being an absolute cunt. So a lot of these nobles got together, and also a lot of the church people got together, and they decided that they'd had enough of King John being a twat. So they rebelled against him, and because John is just one man, he couldn't really fight against them. So they took him and they said, right, sit down in that fucking chair and sign this fucking document, you can't. And he had to fucking sign it. He didn't want to because he liked being a cunt, and he said, fucking hell, fuck's sake, I don't want to sign this fucking shit. I like being a cunt. But they said, fucking sign it or I'm going to shove this fucking sword up your ass. So he had to sign it. And it's really important that he did sign it because it was the first step towards kings not just doing what they wanted anymore, and of the people having some rules, so that they had some rights and some laws that protected people from a bad king or a bad ruler. And it was this first step on the road to parliament and democracy and all the rest of it that we have today. So yeah, rule 1, don't be a cunt. Rule 2, don't shag my wife. Rule 3, don't fucking go around being a cunt all the time. Same as rule 1. Rule 4, don't take my money, etc. So he had to sign the fucking thing. Now, after he'd signed it, he got really pissed off and said, fuck that, I'm going to wipe my ass with it and forget it existed and flush it down the toilet, which he did. And then he went out and got himself an army of sort of private mercenaries, and then he went around trying to kill everybody that had made him sign the document. So this fighting continued in his own country against his own people, and in the end he just fucking dropped dead, and everyone said, good riddance, thank fuck the cunt's dead. And they made his son the king, and his son was a child, so they could try to influence him at a young age and make sure he didn't turn out to be a massive cunt like his father. Um, Also, the Pope was involved in this situation. The Pope was Pope Innocent II, and he was an even bigger cunt than the king. He was the one who started the Third Crusade, and he was also saying that he was the proper boss of England, and he was the real boss of England, and more of a boss than the king, and that the king was just sort of looking after England on his behalf, and that he was like the real king of England. So when John had signed this Magna Carta giving rights to the people, John showed it to the Pope, and the Pope said, "Fuck that. They don't have any rights because I'm the fucking boss of England, not them. So I'm going to say that that document, Magna Carta, is a load of bollocks and toilet paper. So fuck it." So the Magna Carta was disrespected by the king and by the Pope, but in the minds of the English nobles and the English church, Magna Carta was a promise that kings were going to have to start respecting the people and listening to the people and stop acting like cunts. Now, after John died, his brother, his son, Henry, was the king, and he was a little kid. And these nobles had a choice because they could stop him from being king if they'd wanted to. They had arranged for the son of the King of France to come over to England and to be king instead of John. And his name was Louis. And Louis had come to England and helped the nobles fight against John. And now he was ready to be king. And the English nobles said, "Well, John's dead now, so we don't really need you anymore, Louis. So sorry, but would you mind fucking off back to France?" Yeah. And Louis was like, "Oh, for fuck's sake, fucking English cunts." And he went back to France, and he ended up being king of France. Anyway, so what about Henry? It was Henry III, and he was the son of King John and Isabel of Angoulême. And he had similar problems that John had, because he still didn't quite understand this business about the nobles telling the king what to do. He thought that was a bit too progressive, and he wanted to continue doing his own thing. When he grew up, that is. Anyway, this dude showed up in England. He was from France, and he was called Simon de Montfort. And Simon de Montfort was a bit of a cunt who had been going around murdering people who he didn't like for religious reasons. And when he got to England, he became Earl of Nottingham, and he married the king's sister, and he became very influential and important in England. And he ended up sort of arguing with the king about stuff, and he tried to create the Parliament and make Parliament more of a thing in England. There was Parliament, but Parliament was something that the king just arranged, like a big meeting of people to just agree with what he said. Whereas Simon de Montfort tried to make it into an institution that could run the country and tell the king what to do, kind of like a modern parliament. And Henry didn't want that, because he wanted to be fucking king. And De Montfort actually had a battle against Henry and won, so was able to then just sort of push the king around and tell the king what to do. And he brought in all these different reforms and developments in the parliament to sort of represent the different people in the country, and to stop the king from really having much power. So he was more extreme than the Magna Carta had been, and Henry was a little bit easier to push around than John had been. Um, but Henry had a son called Edward, and this son was really fucking pissed off with his father being pushed around by these cunts, and he was a prisoner of de Montfort, and was being kept like a hostage. And one day he was only 16 years old, by the way. One day he decided to escape, so he climbed out the window and he got on a horse, and then he had another horse ready for him that someone had prepared near a tree for him to go on when his horse was fucking tired. So the people who were chasing him, their horses got tired, and he had an extra horse, so he managed to get away. And then there was a big battle between Prince Edward and his guys against de Montfort and his people, and Edward and his guys won, and they got de Montfort's dead body, and they cut his balls off and stuff and chopped it into pieces, and they said fuck de Montfort and fuck all the stuff he's been doing. The king is the boss in England, and anyone who says that he isn't is a fucking cunt. And King Edward was sorry, when Henry III died, Edward became the king, King Edward I. But we'll talk about him next time. So to recap briefly, the Magna Carta was the first step towards England developing a constitution and developing a system of government in which the people are represented, and the king does not have complete power and control over the country and the people. And basically it was the first step on the road from the king being able to do whatever the fuck he wanted to not being able to do fuck all like they are now. And the developments that happened after Magna Carta with Simon de Montfort, even though they failed, they were not forgotten, and the ideas that he had eventually came back and contributed to the development of Parliament in England. So that's the Magna Carta and all that shit.